All right. We're coming back for the third episode. You'll notice that I'm in the same outfit. It's because I'm literally just recording episodes 2 and 3 back to back. But today we're taking a look at what they're calling First Strike. And based on the fact that we just finished up the last episode, I know that it's starting with the Japanese invasion of Indochina. And the fact that that's going to spark the embargo that is ultimately going to lead to the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. So let's go ahead and get started here.
Hanoi, September 22nd, 1940, 2000 hours. General Maurice Martin, commander of French forces in Indochina, sits in a humid meeting room with a general of the Imperial Japanese Army. They're working under a deadline, for in 2 hours, Japan will invade. This had started in June, just after France fell, with a demand from Foreign Minister Matsuoka to cease shipments across the border to China and allow Japanese border observers. But as the months dragged on, the ultimatum has increased. Now, Japan wants the border totally closed and to station troops, ships, and warplanes in northern French Indochina. It's egregious, but Martin has little choice. The Japanese 22nd Army is ready to cross the border at 2200 hours. He makes a counteroffer. How about 6,000 Japanese troops, not 25,000? The general agrees. Whew. An hour before the deadline, word goes out that an agreement has been reached. But when the deadline comes, the 22nd Army invades anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of a trend that we see with the Army at this point. The kind of larger superstructure at the top, the chain of command, was important, and they were in charge, but when certain groups decided, we're going to do it anyway, they did. And the French forces in Indochina, they weren't prepared for a full-scale military intervention, let alone the full-scale invasion of a Japanese army.
Thanks so much to Ground News for sponsoring today's historical tale. Japanese diplomats hadn't expected the Indochina operation to go like that. Theoretically, this was supposed to be part of a diplomatic expansion south, one that was to be accomplished amicably through negotiation. After all, Japan was Germany's ally, and Germany now controlled France. I mean, why wouldn't France just let them in? But again, at this point, Japanese diplomats weren't really running the show. Rather, militarists in the cabinet were directing foreign policy now. And even though Foreign Minister Matsuoka, a man who'd led Japan's exit from the League of Nations, was himself a militarist, even he still had limited power. The military considered the civilian foreign ministry unreliable, and rarely shared their plans with Matsuoka or his subordinates. I mean, they'd sent a general to negotiate in Hanoi, not an ambassador. Meanwhile, low-level military officers were provoking conflicts again, like launching a needless invasion of French Indochina, despite receiving word of a diplomatic solution. And to be clear, we're not talking about a small border skirmish here. We're talking a multi-day undeclared war with tank formations and amphibious assaults. Now, a few months later, the Foreign Ministry did successfully act as a mediator to end a short war between Thailand and French Indochina, but that didn't really change Japan's image as a military aggressor, and at the White House, Roosevelt most certainly still felt that way.
It would be a fascinating reality to see what could have happened if the Japanese military officers during this period weren't so gung-ho about what they're doing, weren't so, we need a military conquest, we need to fight, we need to attack. As they pointed out, a diplomatic solution had been arrived at. They didn't care. They could have moved into French Indochina and achieved every one of their objectives without firing a shot. And instead, military officials decided they're going to invade anyway. And this destroys this idea that Japan is a trustworthy nation that you can work with at the time. You can't trust them to do what they're going to do or do what they say that they're going to do, because every time, progressively, they keep failing to. And it goes back to that major mistake in the Taisho democracy and its structure allowing the military to go off and do its own thing completely. And as the Japanese become more successful throughout the 30s in a lot of people's eyes, a lot of militarists, a lot of people who believe in and support the kind of failing operations that the Japanese military are committing in East Asia get elected to office. Eventually, Hideki Tojo, a former head of the Kwangtung Army, will be placed as the prime minister. I'm getting annoyed. I'm getting mad reciting this, but they really do shoot themselves in the foot so many times in the lead up to this. Realistically, Japan should have never been in this position. They should have never had to deal with this. But instead, because of power-hungry or expansionist generals, they end up in these conflicts anyway.
Over that chaotic summer of 1940, he'd been taking all the actions he could, pitching them as defensive in order to...
Oh, I know where this is going. Because FDR does recognize very quickly how bad things are going, and the fact that eventually armed conflict's going to eventually happen. I don't think it happens until 41, but this is the period in which we have our first peacetime draft. We start just building up the military massively because FDR knows that things are going to go bad. Now, to be fair, that's in part because of Europe. We have Lend-Lease and these arms sales to England throughout the Blitz and throughout the German expansions during this period, but also with Japan, because especially with the invasion of French Indochina, now FDR is starting to see the same pattern repeating in East Asia that has now been happening in Europe, which, funny enough, was inspired by what was happening in East Asia initially. And he's trying to make all these different efforts. Him and his cabinet and Congress at the time are trying to make these efforts to prevent the U.S. from going into the conflict completely unarmed or unprepared.
Avoid backlash from isolationists. In May, he'd stationed the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, where it could credibly threaten Japan should it try to move south. A move the Navy disliked, since it split their fleet and kept it far from its home base. He'd also made diplomatic and congressional moves on what would eventually become the Lend-Lease program, which you can watch our video about here, supplying the UK and other not-quite allies with old military equipment. And after the fall of France, he'd pushed a bill through Congress known as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, expanding the U.S. Navy fleet size by 75%. Not only would this allow the U.S. to simultaneously fight a war in both the Atlantic and Pacific, the expansion focused on aircraft carriers and naval aviation, modernizing a badly aging fleet.
And we'll see that, it won't be in the series, but we'll see that at the Battle of the Coral Sea, in a number of different battles throughout the war. Midway's the big one. At no point do American ships fire on Japanese ships at the Battle of Midway. It is all aircraft from both ships, from both fleets.
In September, he reinstated the military draft, and he began efforts to harden American defenses in the Philippines and Guam, and transform the civilian airstrips on Midway and Wake Islands into Navy air bases. America would not seek a war, the reasoning went, but given the march of German and Japanese aggression, it needed to be ready to fight one. But after the aggression in Indochina, Roosevelt...
It feels like at this point, war is going to be inevitable. It's going to happen.
Roosevelt wanted to directly target the Japanese military. So, he expanded the embargoes of the Export Act to also cover iron and steel scrap, metals crucial for war production. In response, the Japanese ambassador in Washington met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, calling the metal embargo an unfriendly act. The United States was intervening in diplomatic negotiations between allies, he said, where it simply had no part. Besides, Japan was merely trying to stop illegal weapons shipments to the corrupt nationalist regime in China. But Hull knew that argument was a smokescreen, because a U.S. military program known as MAGIC had secretly broken Japan's new diplomatic cipher, Purple. While the decryptions weren't total, and many of the messages were difficult to understand due to code words and poor translations, one thing was clear. The moves in Indochina were part of an expansion south. Yet relations did briefly improve. In November, that ambassador was recalled and replaced with the genial Admiral Nomura, who immediately bonded with Roosevelt over their shared interest in naval matters.
A lot of people forget about this. Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He'd been effectively the second in charge of the entire U.S. Navy and was a major portion for that. Nomura also had a long history of interacting with the United States and visiting and discussing realities with them. It's also fair to point out that American codebreakers being able to actually break purple and being able to know that they have no intention of stopping in Indochina is the biggest deal here. If we didn't have that, we still probably would have maintained the embargo, but knowing that they planned on continuing these efforts made it pretty clear to the U.S. that we needed to, and when I say the U.S., I mean the U.S. government at this point, that we needed to limit or prevent them from getting war-waging materials, because that would only allow them to expand their efforts and expand the conflict during the time period.
Furthermore, Hull and Nomura got along well, meeting regularly at Hull's apartment, where they could be more candid, and Nomura always kept an even temper, even when the two clashed, believing to his core that a conflict would be bad for both countries. But what Hull and even Nomura didn't realize was
and I know where we're going. I've mentioned it in several episodes now. Nomura is retired from the Navy. He's now part of the civilian government. He can make any deal he wants. The Prime Minister can sign off on any deal they want. But the military has shown time and time again that they are not listening to the civilian government anymore, which is going to cause so many more issues and prevent that friendly relationship from actually blossoming into long-term peace.
exactly how much Roosevelt's attempt at deterrence was in fact driving Japan closer to war with the United States. In Tokyo, military and civilian leaders were terrified over Roosevelt's expansion of naval power, because this wasn't just the US leaving behind the naval treaties of the 20s and 30s. This meant new American carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and airplanes coming off the production line every year for the next 5 years.
Which is a major problem for Japan. They have very limited resources. One of the major reasons why they invaded Manchuria in the first place, not a good reason, but the main reason why they did it, was access to resources. Their major push for industrialization following the Meiji Restoration had burned through most of Japan's coal reserves up to that point, and they depleted a lot of their iron deposits as well. So by the time that we get into the late 20s and 30s, they are out of a lot of pivotal material necessary to produce the steel-heavy war industry of the early 1900s. So if the Japanese army wanted to keep getting tanks, wanted to keep getting armored vehicles, wanted to keep getting rifles and equipment, they needed a steady stream of iron or steel, as well as coal, so that you could turn that iron into steel, but that's beside the point. They straight up did not have the resources to match the United States in terms of military power if they really got things going. And this promise to expand the U.S. Navy and Air Force over the next 5 years is truly a promise that if Japan decides that they're going to pick a fight, we are going to ultimately have a much larger force than Japan, or a much better equipped force than Japan could ever field at this point in time. And that's before you factor in the fact that Japan is currently at war with the largest population nation on the planet, China. They are also having to divide all these materials between their navy, which would be the main front that's fighting the United States, or the Japanese army, which needs it if they're going to conquer Southeast Asia, and ultimately win their war in China. They're on the ropes, and instead, now that the United States is pushing further and further for their expanded military force, which again is kind of a necessary item at this point. War seems almost inevitable to Roosevelt at this point in 1940. Japan knows it can't keep up. So the only way that they think they're going to be able to win is a preemptive, fast strike. And we'll get to that later on, I'm sure, but this is a major threat to Japan's success. And they want to take it out as fast as possible.
Currently, the US and Japan had roughly equal navies, with Japan having a slight advantage in merchant vessels, but now that America was on a war-producing footing, that might only last a year or two. So an argument started to circulate. If a war was inevitable, why not fight it soon? After all, every day Japan waited, the US Navy was getting larger, and if Roosevelt cut their oil, the opposite would be true. Each day of non-combat
100%.
operations would mean Japan had less fuel to fight. Japan's attempt to manufacture synthetic oil had failed, and when they made import deals with Mexico, the US leaned on its southern neighbor to get those canceled. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, had a solution. Deter US action by signing a tripartite pact with Europe's totalitarian states of Germany and Italy.
Now we're at the Axis powers. Now we're at those three nations coming together. It's not until 1940. It's after World War II officially begins in Europe. It's years after Japan invaded China. And this is a big deal. Basically, this was designed as a way to prevent American intervention in the war because they thought that the United States would be unwilling to fight all three at once. And boy, that's not going to work out. It's also fair to point out that the Axis has other members. There's other countries involved in the Axis powers in World War II. But these are the three signatories to the treaty that we really think of. The Rome, Tokyo, Berlin Axis is the big group.
Nazi diplomat von Ribbentrop had first suggested such a thing as early as 1938.
You'll notice the name Ribbentrop, by the way. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is the non-aggression pact that we talked about last episode. Was it this episode? No, it was last episode. In the preparations for Germany's invasion of Poland. Germany and the Soviets' invasion. They worked together on that plan. And it's off of Ribbentrop's planning and operational kind of preparations.
And to Matsuoka, it made immediate sense. Germany was one of the few nations to recognize Japan's Manchurian puppet state. All three wanted to deter the US from joining the war, and by signaling a mutual defense pact, it meant America would need to fight a two-ocean conflict. Germany also pledged that the Pacific would be Japan's sphere of influence. Matsuoka's concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
That Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere is a fascinating spin on imperial conquest. Matsuoka and a number of Japanese officials, I believe, truly thought that they were going to make East Asia better with this, completely diluting the fact that they were doing exactly what imperial powers had always done: conquer, brutally suppress, and demolish opposition.
The idea that Japan would throw Western colonialists out of Asia and lead the region to prosperity. Though it should be noted, not everyone was on board with a Nazi alliance. In Tokyo, one colleague warned that Hitler was untrustworthy and routinely violated treaties. After
Because he
all,
was.
Hitler had already broken his anti-communist pact with Japan by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and he hadn't even bothered to inform Tokyo in advance. An alliance hadn't helped them in Indochina after all, and once the pact was signed, Matsuoka had to issue embarrassing statements saying Japan wouldn't be adopting Germany's anti-Semitic policies. But Matsuoka remained committed to the alliance, especially because he believed the Soviets could be enticed to join, forming a bloc of totalitarian nations to challenge the Western democracies. And in 1940, the alliance bore fruit. November 11th, 1940, 250 miles southwest of Sumatra. Officers of the German commerce raider Atlantis board the merchant vessel. They'd come upon it disguised as a fellow merchant ship, then fired at the bridge at close range, killing most of the command. Now they're taking passengers and crew aboard their own ship before scuttling it. But then, one of the passengers asks an officer if they could go get her family's tea set in the ship's vault. And when he agrees and goes to retrieve it, the officer finds more than just porcelain. 15 bags of top-secret mail destined for the British Far East Command. There are maps, decoders, intelligence reports, and a special bag filled with holes so it would sink when thrown overboard. Documents inside detail Britain's plans for the defense of Singapore, troop strength in the region, and how the colonies would fight a potential war. The assessment is grim. Currently, Britain cannot win a fight with Japan. All 15 bags were forwarded to Tokyo, their reception causing a massive stir. The Strike South plan was not only feasible, it should begin soon.
I've never heard of this incident. But that is such a horrific reality. England is already on the back foot. England is barely surviving in its war with Germany. And now plans to straight up state that they cannot truly defend their territories across Southeast Asia against a Japanese force being forwarded to Tokyo. I've largely discussed this before, that the Japanese idea that they needed to knock them out to capture the Dutch East Indies to fuel their fleets, I think they would have likely still gone with it. But this, I'm sure, pushed up the timetable so fast. Because if you know that you can take regions like Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, without much threat, of course they're going to go in and try to do it. That is so fascinating. I don't know how I've never heard of that. Also, could you imagine after the war being that woman who went, oh yeah, could you go get my porcelain tea set, and effectively doomed England's southeast colonies to being overtaken by the Japanese military? I couldn't. That's got to be a horrific reality for them.
But wait, what of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor? If Japan took the Dutch East Indies, it would surely respond. Yet a group of naval officers felt otherwise, arguing that the U.S. fleet could be preemptively destroyed at the commencement of hostilities,
we are at the discussions
giving Japan a year or
Pearl
two
Harbor
to consolidate its wins in Southeast Asia before having to fight the Americans in earnest. It was worth developing a contingency plan. After all, in November, the British had used a fleet of carrier-launched torpedo bombers to raid an Italian port. They should get someone to study that possibility. Lucky for them, one man was eager for the assignment. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Oh man, Zoe, can you imagine?
Yamamoto is a fascinating character individually as well. Although I've never heard of that incident. I'm actually kind of upset with myself that I ever heard of it. But that is a disastrous find for the British. For the Japanese to end up with that, it didn't bode well. All right, we are halfway through the series. I believe this is a 6-parter. But we'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Bye. Oh, by the way, if you have any suggestions or any ideas, please throw them down in the comments. Like I said, I've got 3 more that I'm going to do from this series, and that opens up kind of the floodgates of other extra history or other history-based content that I could do. And I'm kind of curious. I'm not going to do like ERBs. I've seen every ERB, and as a result, I'm not going to go back and do them. That would really be kind of redundant for me to react to something that I've already seen multiple times. Same thing with all the oversimplified videos that are always already out. I've watched so many oversimplified videos, it's crazy. I've watched them all multiple times. I'm not going to watch them. But if you have any specific creators or individuals that you want me to react to or you want me to take a look at, please drop them in the bottom, or please drop them in the comments. And I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.